Robb Wolf, everybody! Oh, and John Welborn.
All right. Is this thing on? Okay, cool.
Check, check, check.
Welcome to another episode of Talk to Me, Johnny, on the long road with my good friend, Robb Wolf. I've known Robb much longer than I care to admit, and I would say that Robb was probably my first CrossFit friend. So you guys all have CrossFit friends, people that you probably would have never met had they never gone to a gym. And I met Robb at the CrossFit Games after CrossFit. We said, hey, do you want to come do this thing called the CrossFit Games? And I'm like, yeah, fuck it, I'll go win. A week before I went to training camp for the Patriots. And I met Robb there, and he comes over with this, like, it looked like a tent, but it was really a XXX shirt. He's like, they gave us one of these by mistake, do you want it? And I was like, sweet, I love free shirts.
And it was, it's all jerks and snatches, our first NorCal shirt, yeah.
And so he hits it with me, and we just started rapping. And he's like, hey, have you heard about this Paleo Diet thing? And we started kind of discussing it, and I think I said to you, I was like, Mauro de Pasquale did all my diet stuff early on, and as we started talking about food quantity, Robb was like, wait a minute, and the diet and really how I'd eaten most of my life, from that was kind of based on eating real foods, and so that's how our friendship started, and next thing you know, we ended up becoming really good friends, and we've still been really close friends, and it's been really exciting to see Robb's evolution because he was kind of the nutrition guy. He taught seminars like I did, and then to be able to come out and write your book and become, two-time New York Times best-selling author, and own gyms, sell gyms, move this, and it's a really interesting progression for the last 10 years. So thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, dude, it's a huge honor, and I have to say when you're pretty well known in a scene, and then that scene kind of jettisons you really discover who your friends are. And it was fascinating to see who kind of disappeared into the periphery and then who came out and absolutely defended and advocated for me and not without personal risk. And that was a sign of a degree of character that is just really rare. So like infinite gratitude for your friendship too. Yeah,
nice.
Thanks, man.
So give us an idea. I mean, it's a really interesting journey. I mean, I know, having, worked on, going to med school, this, and, you were, vegan who almost died, and you kind of get into this, and you guys have read Robb's book, kind of know the story, but you really get deep into this paleo thing, and what's kind of, I don't know whether it's sad or just strange, is that the paleo market has kind of done this, and you've continued to do this based off of food quality and really good information and just trying to help people. And it's really, it's interesting that you got attached into that, but yet you've kind of weathered the storm and continued to do what you've always done. And
Yeah, it's interesting. So Paleo FX is kind of the yearly Paleo Nerd Fest. I think they're in like year 8 or 9. It usually goes down in Austin. And the first year that they did that, they had this panel, the future of paleo, or the state of the nation of paleo. And they asked the question, where do you think all this stuff is going to go? And I said that at some point somebody would take the basic kind of paleo or evolutionary nutrition template, and they would put some really rigid lane lines on what was included in it. They would get a defensible name, trademarkable name, and they were going to ride off into the sunset. And that's Whole30. That's what ended up happening with that. And then I also said that the basic...
Whose people actually came to all your seminars.
Yeah, that's how they got started.
Yeah.
They got started going to my seminars, and then they started their own seminar, wrote a book, and all that type of stuff. But I knew that the technology, if you thought about it like an operating system, like the operating system is really sound, but when you can't control the messaging on something, then you have all kinds of squirrely stuff going on. It's like, oh, you can eat unlimited butter and you'll be fine, and calories don't matter, and and
magic foods.
Yeah, magic foods.
You guys know that butter isn't magic, especially when you put it in coffee, right? It's still calories, even though we've heard that one.
Almost absent any nutritional value. Yeah. And I mean, butter's awesome.
And then Robb recently, wasn't there some study where they're like, it wasn't the butter, it was actually just the coffee?
Right.
Yeah,
that was beneficial. Yeah.
So the interesting part to this is, we've seen a lot of this stuff evolve, and all of a sudden, as the research and the information comes through, and I always go back to Lalonde's thing, where it's like this whole thing's going to blow up unless you can actually steep it in science and not magic.
Right.
But unfortunately, people like magic.
People love magic. People love mysticism, and that's something that's interesting with Power Athlete. Like I mentioned to you yesterday, like John's coached me on my squat, I don't know how many times, but I still, every time you guys present something, I get a new piece. And I was a state powerlifting champion, so I'm not a complete hack with that stuff, but John was talking about like engaging through the big toe is how you fire your glutes in that movement. And I was like, oh, that totally makes sense. And that was a cue that I've never heard. But you guys have always stayed right on this, I don't even want to call it cutting edge, but just very evidence-based, but also willing to experiment. So it's like, okay, here's a pretty good block of knowledge that there's not a lot of contentious issues on, and here's some periphery. And from a marketing perspective, in this day of like the internet, online marketing, it's interesting. Information is a commodity, and anything that is commoditized, its price tends to go to zero over time. So people just don't value information at all. What they will buy into are specific products, experience, and access. And what you guys have done is provide a curated chunk of information, which is knowledge, and that has an incredible value, but it's really difficult to convince people, hey, the reason why you're struggling, the reason why you're not reaching whatever goals it is that you're trying to reach is not a lack of information, it's a lack of knowledge of how to apply the information. And you guys have always just stayed right in that straight and narrow of evidence-based practices, but also being willing to experiment and evolve over time. But it is so easy, and it's so, it is the dark side. It's so appealing to just be like, well, I could just kind of fudge stuff a little bit. And there are some people that are very successful in kind of like the personal development scene, and they'll provide information that's like 80% good. It's 80% on point, and then there's maybe about 5 to 10% of what they release that's just bullshit, but it just sounds just credible enough that you're like, I'll give it a sniff. And most people will give them a pass because they give out enough credible information that it doesn't totally discredit them, but you guys have never done that. And there's a degree of integrity that's really interesting around that, and it's so appealing to want to do that. And we have a personal friend, Matt Lalonde, who's a Harvard chemist and basically the smartest guy in the room, doesn't matter what room he's in. And then
reminds you about it constantly.
He reminds you about it constantly, yeah.
That's why we call him the Kraken, because he gets like, and just karate chops you.
Yeah, but he took both John and I out behind the woodshed multiple times on different things that we were doing. He's like, no, you can't do this. It's like, well, we're trying to say this. And it's like, okay, but you've got to do it in this way. And so we had this Harvard-trained chemist, and I mean, you're a rhetoric, background, and I'm not a complete idiot, haven't done a biochemistry degree, but he was basically like a mentor in that regard.
Yeah, he showed up to our seminar. Rob introduced me to him. I got on the phone and asked him, I was like, hey man, here's the deal. For this seminar to be able to progress, it has to be not about magic and fairy dust. It has to be evidence-based, and I really need somebody that's going to give me an honest opinion and do an AAR of, like,
What'd you get right? What'd you get wrong?
Yeah, basically, like, I hate to say it, but like, I don't want to get fucked. Like, so what happened was Lalonde got into CrossFit, decided he wanted to go to a level 1, didn't say anything, just booked a ticket and showed up. And so a dude with like 170 IQ with a knowledge of organic chemistry, socially awkward, because people that are that smart usually are, but also an extremely very good athlete, very twitchy, very strong, and like unbelievable, like super fast and just kind of super weird.
230-pound standing press at 170 pounds.
Yeah, I mean, just like,
yeah.
He squatted 2 times body weight better than, at our seminar in a set of Vibram 5 fingers, and then went outside and took a nap. Like, just kind of a different cat. And so he sits back there at the, and they get up and they're doing the zone talk, and they're talking about you can zone on beer, potato chips, and, beef jerky, and they're talking about, this, and he's like, what if I were to take what was it? Vegetable oil, soy, and he kind of went through this, started asking these questions. And the guys up there who are, CrossFit, educated, that don't have a science degree, are up there trying to, pontificate and make a lot of these claims. And he's like, can't say that. Nope, that's wrong. And just like literally disrupted the entire seminar to the point where people were like, is this bullshit? And then the nutrition talk came up, and he basically got up and just held court on these guys. And at that point, they sent in, sent up a signal flare, and we're like, hey, we need to hire this dude and at least get him away from our seminars. And so they introduced him to Robb. Robb sees the genius of it, introduces him to me, and I was like, can you come do that for our seminar? Can you show up and be the dude in the back? Because at some point, I'm gonna go sit in front of some people, I'm gonna present for some of these people, and I don't want to have you randomly show up and not be prepared. So we go out, we come back. I remember the night I picked him up, Friday night, before the seminar, it's like, I get him, he comes to the airport, it's like 9 or 10 o'clock, pick him up, I'm like, oh, are you gonna go to bed? He's like, no, I want you to start presenting. I wanna hear it first. And then tomorrow when I hear it again, I'll be able to give you the, so I stood up, we were up till like 3 a.m. Basically, I did the entire seminar for him alone, from the opening talk, nutrition, every piece, in my living room, and him sitting there taking notes. And then finally at like 3, he's like, we have to be up in a little bit. So we went to bed, I got up and he did the same thing. And then he gave me this debrief and was like, you can't say this doesn't work. And he's like, here's your wheelhouse, this is how we need to go. And I went back, redid my seminar. And at that point I realized that the technology that we were creating was, we were trying to bulletproof it. The idea of, food for performance by ramping up immune function through the reduction of inflammation of inflammatory foods and increasing small intestine or increasing health of the small intestine, which effectively relates to the immune system. And through immune function increasing, we can increase recovery, and all these things kind of paired back, and digestion starts in the mouth. And the nutrition talk went into this thing where I was like, holy shit, we can make people into Wolverine. And that was his comment. He's like, how do you think Wolverine heals so fast? I was like, he's magic? He's like, no, he's got a heightened immune system. So I'm like, so we can get immune function up high enough? We can effectively become Wolverine? He's like, 100%. So that was that entire nutrition talk. When we started talking about the athleticism continuum and all the other pieces of this, he's like, you can't have variables that are unknown. You can't just put somebody into a black box, not tell anybody what's in the box, and then tell them that they come out on the other side. People want to know what's in that black box. And so that became like, hey, why do we back squat? And so every piece of this, there's nothing that we don't do where I can't give you a legitimate reason. Those of you guys that were at the practical yesterday, we talked about how the dead bug fits into this with that trunk stability, and then we showed you the rotation on the med ball throws. How many guys had fun throwing med balls? How many people caught a fast one from me? All right, that's the level of intensity at which I approach things. And what hopefully you guys got to see is, it doesn't matter if we're throwing med balls or doing everything, there has to be a level of intensity that takes it up. And then we went over to the back squat, we talked about foot position, big toe, Robb was going through it. All of those are predicated into challenging that universal athletic position and preparing somebody to jump and land and sprint this. And I even said, I don't care what the numbers are, I don't care, if there was a better way to teach it in the back squat, I would teach it. Because I'm not married to that, I'm married to performance and making you better. And I remember going through the lawn, and Lon's like, this makes sense. He's like, I don't think that anybody could sit out here and shoot holes in it, because if they did, I could do it better. And he did the same for Robb's book and did his nutrition. And Lalonde was one of those people that kind of put me, because like you said, it's so easy just to tell stories and it's magic. If you do this, you'll get better. But for most people, but I'm not doing it for most people.
What was cool with Matt is, so information only motivates a very few people, usually the geeks on the periphery. And for how many people in here coach folks for a living? Like virtually everybody, right? That's pretty much why you're here. What motivates the masses? Stories. And so this was the thing that John and I had to go back to Matt and say, okay, how do we make this thing credible, but at the same time be able to maintain the integrity of the stories that actually motivate people to kick the tires on something and give it a change? Because you, again, if you, ketogenic diet, you put that in a search bar, press play, in less than a second you have over 1 million responses. If you go to the second largest search engine in the world, YouTube, and put in ketogenic diet, you get 500,000 responses. So how do you make sense of any of that stuff? You've got to be able to have a story that moves people and they can feel connected to, but then at the same time, it can't just live in storyland.
And that's what people do, where they kind of create this magic, I just stopped eating carbs, and next thing you know, I grew 4 inches, my bank account doubled, my car runs better, my tires don't wear out, and all of a sudden all my blood work fixed each other. And people do this all the time. You guys see it in the fitness world. You know, a guy takes a picture on Instagram, he's like, I've been doing this training program. And it's like, have you really been doing that training program? I mean, it's like, you know, it's just the, you know, the facade that we're in. And I never wanted to be in that situation. I never wanted to put myself in a situation where I thought, oh shit. You know, like a guy like Brian Mann shows up, or Jim, I mean, these, you know, researchers, and having a conversation where they're like, this is bullshit. Because that's the job of the academic, is to call people out on it. We put people through our methodology courses, like ask people that were, you know, within strength conditioning, within academia, to go through it first, and being like, what do you guys think? Is this good? You know, like, where do you see the problems? Where this? And they were like, this shit's on point. People need this. And like at that point, we felt comfortable moving ahead because, and I always talk about the guy, you know, when we teach seminars, I'd always talk about the proverbial Lalonde. You don't want to be up there fucking spinning fairy tales and telling bullshit with a Harvard PhD scientist in the back with 170 IQ and a knowledge of strength conditioning. So you're teaching people for, you know, it needs to be bulletproof, where that guy's like, makes sense, I like it, it's good. And when we went to that level of understanding, but then still being able to offer it in a way that's digestible and fun, then I knew we had something really cool. And then I got a shit ton of opportunities to go teach it. I mean, that's the cool part. We gave away free programming for years, and then we got to travel the world and meet all the people that did the programming and hear the same stories and over again. And then we needed to be able to record the data. We went online through Train Heroic so we could actually get the data points, because we couldn't get consistent data points through a free program. And then we, you know, and I think since Train Heroic, we've logged over 29 million workouts. So we have a huge amount of information that drives towards a certain thing. So when people are like, oh, I did this, you know, I followed Jack Street, I followed Feel Strong, I did this, and it worked, and we're like, tell me the story. Wow, it's amazing. You're the only one. No. Like, because it's not steeped in bullshit. And I think part of the thing that I've always really respected and really just cherished with Robb is one of those people where if he's wrong or he believes something and he gets new information, he will 100% pivot and tell you, what I said in the past wasn't accurate, this is new information, and has that lack of ego. There are some people out there, and a majority of people, that even in the face of that, because they can't, you know, I call him the guru, you know, the Wizard of Oz, can't ever let anybody back behind the curtain, because then he's no longer the Wizard of Oz. And part of the reason Robb and I have stayed such good friends and always respected him, and still respect him, is because he's like me. I've told you guys, if I find a better way to do it, I'll be the first one to say, hey, this is better than what we did, and this is where I learned it. You guys have never heard me say, hey, I invented this shit. You know, we're talking about the med ball stuff that I got from Charlie Francis, or this, and it's all from pieces, and I stand on the shoulders of giants, and Robb's done the same thing. And that's always cool when your friends are like, and dude, you do it all the time. Hey, I thought this, I read this, and now I know something different.
Which hopefully that happens. I mean, there is kind of a reality, and this is one of the funny things. So I'm writing a book on ketogenic diets. It's based off the Keto Masterclass that we developed. And it's cool because we've had a lot of people go through that. We have some social proof. We've been able to iterate on the program, and so we're going to do a print book around that. But when you sit down with a New York publisher to tell them about what you're going to do, they're like, okay, what's new? What's the new thing? What's the new hook, the new angle? And I'm like sitting there thinking, I'm like, okay, guys, so bridges. When bridges were built in the Roman era, they had a lot of shit figured out. It was concrete and rebar and right angles. And when you look at bridges built today, it's concrete and rebar and right angles. Like, at some point, although we're always hoping to iterate and get new insight, there is also this reality that when you pare things down, there isn't necessarily something new. There isn't the next new thing, and that's where the bullshit arises. Like, if you're wanting to find the unique snowflake angle on this stuff, you usually have to lie about it, because otherwise this stuff has been engineered down to a degree that we really do have a pretty good understanding of most of this stuff, whether it's nutrition or whatever. And probably the biggest insight into nutrition, we've had these macronutrient wars going on for 60 years, and we have examples of high-carb diets that work, we have examples of low-carb diets that work. The reality is people are highly individual. What's going to work best for them is going to be kind of an individual process, That may change over time based off of age. Like we've done a lot of work within the SEAL community, and those guys will be motoring along great for a period of time, and then they get a gut bug in Afghanistan, and they just explode. They just come apart at the seams, and then their gut's never the same after that. And if they're going to continue operating at a high level, they have to do some stuff different. But they fundamentally change. But from an engineering perspective, there's just a ton of truth in like the strength and conditioning and nutrition world. But the main points of deviation isn't so much that this person's right or that person's wrong. It's more that there's an individual need for the folks that we're working with. But with what we understand now around like blood sugar testing, which is really interesting, like ages ago, you had figured out that if you keep your blood sugar under a certain level, based around the types and amounts of foods that you eat, he wouldn't gain body fat. And it's not so much about like the insulin hypothesis, but if you don't have big blood sugar excursions, then you don't get hungry after the meal, and so you don't overeat. But you had figured that out like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, something like that.
Dr. Tom recommended.
Okay.
He said, hey, get a glucose meter. And if you can test your glucose and kind of figure out what your baseline is, and you find different ways to manipulate it, and you keep it, I forgot, it was like under 85, or I think it was 80 or 85. He's like, and there's all these different ways to manipulate it. Like one of them's through exercise, through non-media glucose uptake. Cinnamon, and there was all these, Dr. Tom-esque, alpha lipoic acid, different ways. And then I actually figured out that there were a series of foods that I could eat that didn't spike blood sugar. And then I remember we went out, I want to say we had like Thai food, or I had something, and I came back and like my fat or my glucose stool was like 200. And I like couldn't see. I was like, my eyes were hurting. And I remember getting on, I had a Aerodyne in my house, and I got on, I'd ride the Aerodyne for like 20 minutes, and all of a sudden, right back where I needed. And so I just found ways to mitigate it, and then, we just experimented and figured out that like if I could keep it at a certain point and find the foods that kind of worked. And I remember Tom, when I first went and got blood work from him, he did a food panel allergy deal, and he like kind of like charted all these foods in red, yellows, and greens. And he was kind of like going through and explaining. I was like, if I just eat all the green foods, am I better? And he's like, yeah, but, and he's kind of, well, I'm like, no, let's eat all the green foods. And he's like, I don't think anybody's ever said that before. He's like, everybody wants to have this, but this is my favorite food in this. And I asked him, like, well, if I just eat the green foods, I'm totally fine. Just eat the green foods. I don't care. And all of a sudden, when I saw him, he's like, how you feeling? I'm like, I feel like $1 million. Just ate the green foods. And he's like, that's weird. And Tom. And I don't really have a love-hate emotional relationship with food. Food for performance, like that's why, like, hey, I want to eat so I can be bigger and stronger and perform better. Whereas, like, people are like, oh, I can't give up my chocolate cake. I can't give up this. I'm like, I don't care. Like, so it's been good, and like just that, that blood sugar thing, and then obviously the work I did with Morrow was extremely interesting. I did a bunch of work in nutrition at Berkeley, and I remember when I got Morrow's book and Morrow started working with me, I was like, man, this is exact opposite. This is the opposite side of the paradigm from what they were teaching. Where it's like, oh, saturated fat's evil. Everybody needs a high carb diet, and this, and protein will cause kidney failure if you eat more than 40 grams of protein in one sitting. Right. And I remember thinking like that was the standard paradigm. When I read Morrow's stuff, where it's like, no, you need saturated fat. You want to have a really crappy androgen profile, eat no saturated fat. And I'm reading all this, and then and then that's how I got into understanding carb cycling and using insulin to be able to increase, body weight in this, and that was really interesting. And then as I got into it,
and keep in mind, this is like early '90s, so like the recommendation of a low carb diet at this point was madness. Yeah. And and they just. And there was the idea that you'll never be able to lift weights fast or do anything on a low carb diet. And I ate pretty much a low carb, ketogenic, kind of cyclical keto, anabolic diet for my entire NFL career. Most of it. And I wonder if sometimes, and I've never been able to prove it, but when we went to go get some of the cognitive testing done, maybe that was a reason, through lack of inflammation, and you go to these million different factors. We've seen with the SEALs that they get, like he said, like a gut bug, and all of a sudden they have joint issues, and all of a sudden it stems, and realize that if you want to really analyze somebody's health, their whole systemic health, really that small intestine becomes the window for that. And then that's where the diet stuff really became about, and the interesting thing about small intestine, it's the most anabolic organ in the body, and it can heal itself.
So if you give it what it needs, it gets better. And so a lot of this, I mean, and what's crazy is most of this stuff was figured out with Robb. And we had like an email chain where Lalonde was forwarding us research every day of like 20 things, to the point where we were like, just stop, dude. I'm so far behind on this reading. And then he would quiz us. But like, it was really good, and just being able to get that much information and then have really, really intelligent friends as a sounding board. And I always loved not being the smartest dude in the room, and I was definitely a few steps below. Like, oh, you went to Berkeley? Oh, yeah, I'm at MIT. At Harvard. Like, all right, whatever, Harvard guy. But I think that piece for me was really exciting, because I'm in this perpetual state of learning, but I don't want to get fed bullshit. Like, even if it's a tough pill, we still got to hear it. So.
But maybe circling around to something that's popped up again and again throughout the weekend. Arguably, neither one of us would be doing what we're doing had we not had those people like Matt. Matt's never asked a thing in return. And it's not that, sometimes you compensate people for their time. Sometimes they take you on in a mentorship role. But we've had really key people basically like pull us in and like, hey man, here's this help, whether you want it or not.
Ken Ford was another one. You guys have heard him on our podcast. Ken Ford's another really smart individual, builds like robots that fight other robots, DARPA funded deal. And like reaching out, and I'm like, this guy's really like, I think I hit up Robb. I'm like, are you sure this guy knows who we are? Because this dude is way outside of our league. And it's been another really interesting piece. So as we've gone through this, but the one thing that's always been good is that, we've seen these trends where, things are hot and this, and it's just like, I don't know if people can make those claims like without, it feels like in fitness and training and nutrition, unsubstantiated claims are really like the path to success, but that's a lack of integrity. And I always go back, you guys have heard me say on the podcast from Good Will Hunting, when the guy's like, you'll be serving my kids fries, and he's like, at least I won't be unoriginal. And I think that like idea of like, I don't want to be a bullshit artist and I'm not going to take anything, I just don't want to be unoriginal, has been kind of a singular theme for us and also for Robb. So let's talk about the keto thing, man.
Sure.
The keto diet is also steeped in magic. And, the idea, and like if you turn on anything, everybody's a keto expert, which is ironic because when the paleo thing came out, everybody was a fucking paleo expert. And, the problem with teaching from something is like there were these people thousands of years ago that were really healthy. We should go back and be them. Well, the problem with that was like, we don't have any historical information. We've never tested them. And the only thing we have is Weston Price's observations based off of, hunter-gatherer tribes that were from the 30s. And so that's, and when I always talk about like anthropology is not really science, it's a social science, and observation alone. I mean, if we sat in here and observed this group and tried to, do scientific studies based off the observations, they would all be wrong. So with the keto stuff, I mean, how are you really cooking it down, and how is it, is it a better application? Because the one that you blew my mind with was the salt intake.
Right.
And the fact that a lot of the keto fog and a lot of the issues that people run into come from a lack of electrolyte balance.
In big picture way to look at this, humans should be able to operate on a really broad spectrum of nutritional inputs. Like ideally, we should be able to eat a lot of carbs and not have near diabetic blood sugar levels. The flip side is if we don't have food for a couple of days, that shouldn't totally crater us and make us incapable of functioning. And when we look out at the modern world, that's a lot of what we see. Like I'm sure a ton of your clients, and maybe even for myself, before I kind of got myself a little more metabolically healthy, metabolically flexible, if 2 hours went without me eating, I was starting to be like, okay, man, where's the next meal? Because when that low blood sugar thing kicked in, it was going to be a disaster. And so a lot of the efficacy of the ketogenic diet is just that we never, in the story of feast and fast, which is normal within nature with virtually any organism, we have constant feast and absolutely no fast, and no periods of scarcity. And so we tend to lose our metabolic flexibility. And it's interesting for a lot of people, they may have damaged themselves to a degree that they just need to be in a much lower carbohydrate intake than what would maybe be appropriate from an ancestral diet perspective, but it's the only place that we can take these folks and have them effectively be healthy. And the ketogenic diet's interesting in that it's kind of one of the only dietary approaches that is binary. Are you in or are you out? If you have measurable levels of ketone bodies, then it's kind of like, okay, we're doing something there, although that's turned into a dietary dick measuring contest where people assume that the higher their ketone levels are, the better they're doing. So then they'll reduce protein intake and they'll eat a stick of butter and they're like, man, I'm getting fat and my cholesterol and lipoproteins went to the moon. Is that a bad deal?
And for a long time, and I think, like I remember you actually were like, because people were like, oh, too much protein kick you out of ketosis, gluconeogenesis is a big issue. And I think and I always said, I was like, I think that's bullshit. So when I was eating a ketogenic diet and I was doing my blood sugar, I knew exactly where, and I was eating 300 or 400 grams of protein a day. Obviously I'm 300 pounds at the 170 pounds of lean body mass, and all of a sudden, and you guys have heard me say, I thought that I could process more protein. Why? Because I was doing a heavy style of training, I was a bigger person, carrying more lean body mass. I think that also the larger small intestine, the fact that I was taller helped. There were all these factors that I necessarily couldn't prove, and there was no research to support it, but it was just kind of like, I think this could be a case. And then people being like, oh, no. If you eat more than 0.6 grams of protein per pound of body weight, it's going to kick you into neogenesis and you're not going to be able to stay in ketosis. And that wasn't true for me. But then when I asked Rob, he's like, well, you're an outlier. Okay, so I'm an outlier, so this is what works for me. Is it individualized? Because other people it might not work for. So why does it not work for them? Are they not lifting weights? Are they not training? What do they look like? What does their metabolic pathways look like developing? Have they been doing this stuff for a long time? Or hard charging out? So, there's all these variables. So for me to say, hey, this is what works for everybody, based off of me, doesn't work, right? That just is bullshit. So what we needed to do was be able to test it, and we always made that point, and then Rob comes back and is like, I think we can handle a lot more protein than what we think, and when people drop their protein low and the fat goes high, all of a sudden shit goes wrong. Pretty accurate?
Yeah, completely. And it's interesting because this paleo diet idea is really powerful. Like when I first got into this, I was an autoimmune and cancer-oriented researcher first, and I had ulcerative colitis so bad I thought I was gonna die from it. And so immediately I started seeing applications for this like gut-related, systemic inflammatory autoimmune conditions. But this was 1998. There were no studies. There were a few hypothesis-based papers, but I literally was the crazy guy, suggesting that there was some application to this. And today we have 15, maybe 20 randomized control trials looking at interventions related to anything from ulcerative colitis to rheumatoid arthritis, and the really favorable results. So we're in a spot where the general idea that there are immunogenic foods has really been vindicated. And so we can kind of move forward with that, but it's interesting if you take this basic idea of finding an appropriate glycemic load for folks. So again, to John's point about keeping his blood sugar within certain bounds, that's going to be different from person to person and depending on their situation. But if we build this whole thing from the following perspective, let's find an appropriate glycemic load for an individual, and then let's kind of kick the tires on some known potentially immunogenic foods. And immunogenic is that we get an inappropriate immune response from a particular food. Gluten, soy, there's lots of stuff that fit that. But pretty quickly we can test all that. We can figure out the appropriate glycemic load. We can put people on an elimination diet where we pull the commonly known allergenic foods out, reintroduce, see how they do. Within like 2 months, we've really have the potential to move somebody to a highly sophisticated yet also simple way of eating that is kind of optimized. It's so close, and then you can start talking about time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting, but that is, you're into the realm of maybe you get 1% more return on investment with maybe 50% increase in effort. Like that kind of inverse Pareto principle is definitely at play there. But what's interesting about it is that in this case, you don't need all the stories about hunter-gatherers and all this stuff that can get you out in the weeds and really get you in trouble from a scientific perspective. If we just hang our hat, which again, this is what Lalonde pointed out quite a while back. Think about the glycemic load, think about the immunogenic potential of foods, experiment with that, and that, again, from the bridge building analogy, like that's about as good as nutrition is ever gonna get, And so, okay, what do we do with that? You don't necessarily have anything new to spin, so you have to figure out better ways of coaching and reaching people. Like within the work that I do, we're really getting interested in motivational interviewing. So we're trying to find the people that are ready for change, because you have a limited amount of time, you have a limited reach, you don't want to waste time on people that aren't ready. And so it's funny, we've really shifted, and it was fascinating looking at who you brought in for this symposium. It was very heavy on the kind of like coaching and self-discovery side. And I think as coaches, that's the next level that we have to kind of bring out to our clients, is really helping both them and ourselves determine who is ready for that next step of change. I'm doing work with the Chickasaw Nation right now. They have a really interesting program that they've put together that looks virtually identical to what we did with the City Zero project in Reno. But what they're faced with is a massive need, but very limited resources, just in a throughput perspective. Like they have a 85% insulin resistant population, and I even think that is overly conservative, like it's probably higher than that. But we have so many people that need help, we need to really focus on just the people that are ready for change. And so it's interesting, even though I'm like this very mechanistic-based person, where the rubber hits the road is that ability to build rapport, create relationships with people so that they trust you, and then we can take this technology and then help roll it out to folks. So it's fascinating that we have gotten around to this spot where I think all of us are probably going to maximally benefit from learning motivational interviewing techniques and figuring out who's ready for change. Because even if we do a very slapstick approach to the nutrition and the strength and conditioning, that's going to be so much better than what folks are already doing. But if we can't delineate who's ready to change versus who's not, that person who's not ready to change, they're occupying a space that somebody else could be really making amazing progress with.
Damn. I want to change gears a little bit, and I want to rap about salt.
Okay.
This was a pretty interesting one for me, in that we started kind of testing, through Robb's recommendation, like, how much salt intake are you doing? I'm like, I don't know, I salt my food. He's like, I want you to start measuring it. And we started kind of playing with like the amounts and the numbers. And I remember, what was it, the epidemiology of salt was like, at 0, your mortality was like
super high.
Super high.
Yeah.
But then as you were ramping it up, and I think it was like there was no change.
So there's this, in biology, there's often these things called U-curves. When you look at like disease potential or morbidity, mortality, like with vitamin D levels, if you have very, very low vitamin D levels, you have a high likelihood of morbidity and mortalities. And then when vitamin D kind of gets optimized for you, you're at the lowest potential for morbidity and mortality. Then too much vitamin D, you start getting problems. So there's this kind of sweet spot, and tons of biological phenomena have this kind of U-curve. And in the case of sodium, it's really interesting. And this study was done in cardiac patients, insulin resistant. These people were as fucked up as you could get. And what was interesting is there was a U-curve, but at lower than 2 grams of sodium intake a day, which is what the standard of care recommendations are, the morbidity and mortality was very, very high. And then it tended to level out. The lowest instances of morbidity and mortality were at about 5 grams of sodium intake a day, which is more than double what the recommendations were. But then you had to increase sodium intake up to 8 grams to be as at risk for complications, morbidity and mortality, as what you were at 2 grams. And so it's a very flat, problems start occurring, but they occur very slowly on the upper end. And this is in a sick population. And so that was kind of a mind blower study. And even though it's very compelling, the standard of care recommendations around sodium intake and like hypertension have been very, very slow to change. But then if you dig around, like in the ACSM recommendations around sodium, for an active individual, so different variables, highly active, heat, humidity, their recommendations range up as high as 10 grams of sodium a day, which is a pretty large number. And this is for like the average 170-pound person, which around here, like myself and most of the females are under 170 pounds, and that's it. So a larger individual is gonna need more. When I do jujitsu, my gi weighs like 5 pounds, and So my sodium needs arguably are quite high. And I had struggled, I felt cognitively best with kind of a low-carb ketogenic diet, but I didn't have that lower gear for doing anaerobic type activities like jujitsu. And I reached out to the Keto Gains guys, Tyler and Luis, really great dudes. And I told them what I was up to, and they're like, you're not taking in enough salt. I'm like, no, I salt my food. I'm like, so I went to people for coaching. They gave me advice. What did I do? I fucking ignored it. Of course. What do you always do?
That's what you always do with advice.
Yeah, that's
right?
what you always do with
If
advice.
you're giving it for free, it's worth nothing.
Yeah,
so why would I follow
exactly.
it?
Yeah, they're my friends, so I'm going to ignore them. So a year goes by, and they're like,
Isn't that a distance bias that the closer somebody is in your circle, like if somebody in your town, they can't be an expert.
Right.
You have to go 4 towns over for somebody to be an expert. You got to fly halfway around the world, or like we always joke about giving a family or parents advice, and then being like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're like, people think we know what we're talking about. Well, you can't.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So a year goes by. I'm still struggling in jits. They still tell me the same thing. And then finally one day, and on Keto Gains, if you go like Keto Gains electrolytes, they have a whole how to do it, like mixing your keto aid stuff. And I did it, and it was like literally a light switch was flipped. I'm like, oh fuck, okay. And the funny thing is I figured this out like almost 3 years ago, and then I've been looking out at the market, and I'm like, nobody's doing this right. And I kept waiting and waiting and waiting. So finally, like a year ago, we started developing an electrolyte drink that hopefully we're gonna launch in January. But the thing that stopped me from doing it is I kept saying, it's just fucking salt. Like, I can't. And the name of the company is Salty AF, and it's in the tagline is it's just fucking salt, you know? So I mean, there will be no hyperbole in this thing.
It sounds kind of like Johnny Wad.
But it's fascinating. But there is some historical, when you want to tell a story around this, so we can look at this from like epidemiology. There's great sports science that suggests that increasing sodium intake will, at a minimum, mitigate, like hypovolemic stuff, like where people feel low blood pressure, maybe a performance-enhancing element. Like that stuff hasn't been super well studied. But if you do, this gets out there a little bit. Lalonde would probably sign off on it.
It's all right,
if I couch it appropriately.
Yeah, we're
but within the Abrahamic religions, typically an animal is killed and then it's bled. And when we look at the chemical composition of the intracellular fluids versus the extracellular fluids, a lot of sodium exists outside of the cells, and this is the whole sodium-potassium pumps and that gradient, and it's what drives life. But when an organism dies, those things equilibrate. And there's actually a lot of sodium in us, in cows, in deer. But what we've done historically when we process these animals is remove the sodium at the time of death, and then when we do a chemical analysis on muscle meat, it looks very low in sodium. But if we were to eat something that was even field hunting, like you don't typically bleed them quite as quickly. So the sodium content could be multiple times higher if we were to account for all that stuff. So there, within Lauren Cordain's work, Lauren was on point with a ton of stuff. I mean, that guy was...
Except the salt thing.
Except the salt thing. But this was based off of looking at information that was biased towards the way that the animals were processed. So even if we were to look at just kind of a whole carcass analysis, there's a lot of salt that exists within a deer, a cow, whatever, and depending on how that, either we need to process it differently, which probably isn't gonna happen, or we need to supplement it outside. And there's only one, people will say, oh, I feel like I need to eat this, my body needs it. It's bullshit. There is one nutrient that your body has a taste for, and it's salt.
Well, it was a currency for the Romans. I
Right.
mean, the age-old, somebody worth their salt came down to the idea that the sailors and different people were paid, or the Roman soldiers were paid in salt. So, I mean, obviously they understood the commodity, and I remember Lauren came and spoke at a seminar we were at, came in, and I remember him going through the whole salt thing, and I actually brought that up. I'm like, so wait a minute, I mean, he was big on the limitation thing, but I don't know if he's since pivoted on that, but...
No, he has not, and that's one of the problems with Lauren is that, love the guy, he's a solid person, was a really great mentor in a lot of ways, but he is so enamored with that paleo diet concept that he has been
Well, you remember he wanted to fight.
Intractable.
He wanted me
on
to
this stuff.
he
On the
wanted-
IGF and like dairy.
and adding dairy with a paleo diet and as a way to put on muscle and gain. And we were talking about this at a table when we were going to do a presentation, and I thought I was gonna have to fight this old man over it.
Right.
He started getting all fucking, and he's pretty prickly, I guess is a good
very
word.
prickly.
Yeah, very prickly.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm gonna have to beat this old man's ass. And he was ready to go, like started screaming at me, and I'm like, wait a minute, we're at a talk, we gotta get up here in a little bit, like. So I mean, but that comes down to that flexibility, that growth mindset, whether or not the information that you've staked on your life, like there's a piece that's wrong. If all of a sudden he pivoted and said, hey, what I thought was improper, now I think it's in this good direction, all that does is add credibility and shows people that you're in this growth mindset. And I think what pisses me off with a lot of stuff within fitness and nutrition is people are like, this is it, there's no other way, no information is new, and I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna hold all these people real close to me so they don't hear anything else, and then I'm just gonna throw rocks at anybody else that says anything different. And for me, I don't wanna be around people like that. I always wanna be in that perpetual learning. If there's new information, new technology, and there's something that we can do to increase performance or make people healthier or better, then we should go in that direction. I mean, we've had Dr. Tom speak at numerous symposiums, and every time he's like, I learned everything new. Everything I knew in the past was wrong, so here I'm here to present. And we have to do that because if not, we don't want anybody to think that we're not cutting edge, but that becomes really the mark of success and the mark of the people that I want to surround myself with, is that growth mindset.
Well, and it's tough for someone like Lauren because he should get like a Nobel Prize in medicine, like for a couple of different things. He is the person that's proposed a mechanism whereby intestinal permeability is the precipitator for potentially all autoimmune conditions. And it's amazing work, absolutely amazing work. But in his body of stuff that he put forward, this sodium piece was one thing, and then this acid-base balance was another piece. And just coaching people was really interesting. So, we're running these gyms, we're working with people, and I'd make this, basic paleo diet recommendation, cut the salt and don't use things like vinegar, for like salads because of the acid-base balance. And these were the points where people were like, fuck it, I'm out, I'm done, I can't do that. Whereas in just looking at where people were willing to buy in, if I let them salt their food ad libitum and have some latitude with things on that acid-base balance story, then they could buy in. And I knew that for the bulk of people, if I got them off gluten, if I got them off sugar, like it was gonna be a huge net win. So just observationally, I saw that those were just some break points. And then it turned out those were actually the points where the science was incorrect. And so it's too bad for Lauren in many ways, because now all the really good work that he did is kind of getting ignored because he's dug his heels in on these really specific topics that the science just hasn't borne out. And he's published a ton of papers, he's gotten a ton of shit right, and then he's gotten some stuff wrong. It just didn't stand the test of time, and that's okay. But this is where people change due to stories, and so this paleo diet concept can be really a good story to tell to people, but you have to be careful in how you couch it, And unfortunately for Lauren, it's become effectively a religion, and then he's become incapable of modifying his position on these, just kind of peripheral points. Like he could go back in, rejigger the data and be like, oh, okay, the sodium isn't as concerning a feature as what we thought it was, and here's kind of the historical backing, and here's what the epidemiology suggests on the topic. So yeah, it's tough, but again, like this is kind of a macrocosm going to a microcosm. I think even just within our own practices, like being honest with our clients, and if we're recommending something to them, for a couple of years, and it's like, hey, I got to tell you, like what I've been saying, I think we need to change directions, just being honest about that. You guys know this, but it's sometimes hard. It is funny, if you don't change your position, then people will throw rocks at you, but I can't tell you how many people have just like hung me out to dry for me changing position on some stuff, and I'm kind of like, okay, so you want me to dig my heels in?
Well, but it's because people want to put people in boxes, right? You're the paleo guy. Like my favorite is, let's say a professional athlete like LeBron James comes out and he makes a political statement. People are like, just continue to shoot baskets. I don't want to hear this.
Stay in your lane.
Yeah, stay in your lane. The dude makes $2 or $3 million a game. He pays collectively more taxes than like probably the state of Texas. He's an educated, like you go through all these things, and the guy's like socially, he's like helped like 1,100 kids get scholarships and boys clubs, and personally done all of this stuff. And you're like, that doesn't entitle him to his own opinion? So like that blows my mind, but yet people want to do that all the time. Like, what do you know? You should just do this. And I'm just like, oh my God. Like that's because you do something well, like Robb, went out and I remember at Robb's nutrition seminar when he worked with CrossFit, him getting up and having to teach the zone diet was hilarious because I'm like, oh, this is tough because they want him to teach his own diet. And Robb was giving all these tricks on how to make the zone diet
How to make
work.
it not suck, basically.
Yeah, how to not make not suck. Right, 5 times fat and this, and I read the book and like I knew, we'd seen the zone before and it just, there was just some issues. Like there's no magical balancing of macronutrients that's gonna somehow make you bulletproof and increase your bank count, whatever. And there was some magic in that. And I remember sitting there listening to Robb like unfuck this thing for like 2 hours and then being like, why don't you just say, and then the best is he goes through all these macros, only this and we're gonna do it. And then it gets to food quality, which they didn't talk about, because you can zone up beer, potato chips, and beef jerky. And then Robb gets into this whole food quality thing and this, and it's just, I was like, why don't you just say the food quality? And like, if you are obsessive or you want to know how much you're consuming, you should probably maybe weigh and measure your food for a little bit just to give you an idea, because sometimes most people have no fucking idea, concept of how much they're eating. Most women are terrible under eaters. Most dudes, I feel like I'm doing all right, and then you go crush and eat like 5,000 calories, and you're like, I can't believe I haven't lost a pound. Well, yeah, like in basic caloric thermodynamics, you go through the whole deal. So I always recommended, I think everybody should weigh their food just for a little bit, just so that all right, in my hand, this is how much I'm eating, and you can kind of ballpark it. And if you're training hard, eat more. It was interesting to go hear Robb have to give a nutrition talk because the mothership wanted him to give this, and listening to his fixes and realizing this is tough.
Right.
And
right.
Did a great job, was extremely impactful, but I think people left there a little more confused. So wait a minute, why do I have to do it this way?
Right.
And then
I wrote an article for the performance menu called 42 Ways to Skin the Zone. It was all these takes on this stuff, and it was hilarious. We had a guy write in, he's like, there's not 42 ways to do this, there's only 8. I'm like, this is from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the answer to the universe and all that shit.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's just funny.
And then, even within the training stuff, Robb comes from a similar background. He was a big Fred Hatfield guy and always used compensatory acceleration, and it was something that he's like, I thought everybody did that stuff. I'm like, so did I. And Robb's extremely strong, and he's, whether it be dumbbells, deadlift, everything, extremely twitchy. And when you watch Robb lift weights, his ability to go from that static position to a very explosive has always been there, and it was always a lot of fun to train with him. And then when we started talking about training, to realize that the principles that I had subscribed to as a young kid were the same ones that he had. And Robb was telling me, he's like, I don't really have the genetic stuff, but we think that the epigenetic adaptation of basically always forcing yourself to move the weight as fast as you can has resulted in... Yeah,
a 23andMe analysis, I'm not fast twitch, but I can still touch a basketball rim. As a 18, 19-year-old kid, I could flat foot dunk a tennis ball and stuff like that. And I had just always trained in this compensatory acceleration. When there was a flight of stairs to go up, I would explode up the stairs. It's I didn't do anything slow. And so even though I wasn't genetically wired, I would never be a world-class Olympic lifter, power lifter, sprinter, what have you, but because the style of training I've done throughout my lifetime, I am technically a fast twitch athlete. And we were talking about this last night. What's really interesting about it, when you look at the characteristics of aging, the first thing that goes are the large motor units that provide power. And so you could really make an argument that the power athlete training protocol is arguably maybe one of the best anti-aging strategies that you could do. because you get enough metabolic conditioning so that you're hitting both that aerobic and anaerobic
And mitochondrial density.
characteristics. Pardon?
And the mitochondrial density.
The mitochondrial density, all that stuff gets addressed. You get mobility, you get the neurological plasticity of constantly doing new stuff, but then also just on the kind of gross level, those big motor units, you have to either lift heavy and or go very fast. And you guys do a really fascinating mix of both. And for my jiu-jitsu, I mean, this was maybe 8 years ago.
Yeah, Rob hit me up and said, hey, can you help me with some training stuff? So I wrote like a 2-day-a-week kind of flexible program based off of what I knew with Rob and the idea of like, hey, we're gonna really let reps and weight dictated by speed and his ability to move a weight as fast as he can. And I ended up writing him this kind of push-pull, accessory deal. And then I sent it to him, he's doing it, it's great. And then he's like, I still follow that program.
Yeah, I mean, almost 10 years later, and there's little tweaks and fiddles. Sometimes it's 1 lift a day, and so I break all that stuff out, and I'll hit 1 lift a day. Sometimes it's still that 2-day-a-week, but it's still vertical press, vertical pull 1 day, and then a hinge or a squat, horizontal press, horizontal pull, a hinge or a squat. If I go heavy on the hinge or a squat 1 day, then I go lighter on the next day. I'll do 2 to 3 weeks of compensatory acceleration, then I'll do usually a week or 2 of basically going up to a max effort. And max effort being super relative, like the bar speed still needs to be less than a second, but then as soon as it starts grinding down a little bit, then I back it off a little bit, I get some volume in on it. And now I'm not huge, I'm not anything like that, but doing jiu-jitsu at 46, if the person is 100 pounds heavier than I am, then I feel it. If the person is within 20 pounds of me, now there are people more technical, but as far as their strength, power, and being able to put pressure on me, I can't even feel it. So like I am so well physically prepared for doing jiu-jitsu as a guy that's almost 50 from doing a 2-day-a-week template that I've just had minor tweaks and iterations on, but like we've talked about, like there's so many gizmos and shenanigans out there and everything, and it's like, well, just get a weight that you can handle and move it fast but under control. Do mobility work, do some other, like I still do at least 2 days a week of med ball work, and people are kind of freaked out by me, given my age and relatively how small I am, what I'm able to do doing jiu-jitsu and Thai boxing and stuff like that. I'm no Robb Wolf, but who is, so yeah.
Well, cool. Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, well, thank you, Rob. I appreciate
Guys,
you coming
thank you.
on.
Yeah,
Always great to see you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we need 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Stretch your legs. Get some.